In the quiet, unassuming town of Briarbell, Missouri, a legend lingers in the shadows. They call him the Tall Man, a figure so eerie, so deeply unsettling, that even whispering his name is said to bring shivers down your spine. His towering frame, pale complexion, and unervingly polite smile are etched into the town's lore, whispered about in hushed tones, a bedtime story meant to frighten children into obedience. But for one group of daring friends, curiosity overcame fear. They decided to uncover the truth behind the legend, to step into the dark and face what no one else dared to. What they found inside that abandoned house was something far worse than any story the town had ever told. Welcome to Eerie Road Tales, where we delve into the most chilling mysteries, folklore, and supernatural encounters that haunt the edges of our reality. Tonight, we take you to the heart of Briarbell, where a seemingly innocent dare turned into a nightmare these friends would never escape. Briarbell, Missouri, had always been a quiet town, the kind of place where life moved at a slower pace, and everyone seemed to know each other. But beneath its serene surface, Briarbell held secrets, dark, lingering whispers of a legend that no one dared to speak aloud after dark. The legend of the Tall Man. The Tall Man wasn't just a ghost story. For generations, townsfolk believed he was something far worse. He didn't haunt, he appeared. They said he came in times of despair, drawn to places of emptiness, abandoned homes, broken lives, and aching hearts. Always the same description: impossibly tall, his frame unnaturally stretched, with a pale, expressionless face and an eerie, polite smile. And when he appeared, things disappeared. People, pets, and sometimes just the hope that things could ever feel normal again. For a group of kids growing up in Briarbell, the Tall Man was a thrilling mystery, a challenge to uncover the truth behind the whispers. They were close-knit, bonded by a love for adventure and the thrill of scaring each other with tales of monsters and ghouls. To them, the legend of the Tall Man wasn't just a cautionary tale, it was the ultimate dare. Then there was Mr. Winscot, the old man who lived in the worn-down house at the edge of their street. He was kind but quiet, often seen tending his small garden or sitting on his porch. Life had been hard on him. He'd lost his wife years ago, and his children had moved far away. Over time, he seemed to fade into the background of the town, his presence as fragile as the creaking boards of his home. But then, one day, Mr. Winscot disappeared. No goodbyes, no signs of where he might have gone. Just an empty house and an unsettling stillness that seemed to seep from its walls. The kids were quick to connect the dots. Mr. Winscot had been sad, lonely, a perfect target for the Tall Man. And when some of them claimed to have seen a shadowy figure in his upstairs window late at night, they knew they had to investigate. Legends like the Tall Man don't just come from nowhere. They're rooted in the fears of small towns, the kind of fears that thrive in the dark corners of quiet lives. Briarbell had its fair share of stories, but this one felt different, closer, more real. And for these kids, the line between myth and reality was about to blur in the most terrifying way. It started as a whispered challenge, a dare tossed around in the warm glow of a fading summer evening. The group of 5 kids, Tommy, Lizzie, Max, Sarah, and Jake, had spent countless hours trading spooky stories, each one trying to outdo the other. But this was different. This wasn't just a story, it was real. Mr. Winscot's house stood at the end of the street, a looming figure of decay that had grown eerier since his sudden disappearance. "I bet you won't even make it to the porch," Tommy teased, his voice brimming with the bravado of a 12-year-old who wasn't entirely sure he believed his own courage. "Fine, Lizzie shot back, crossing her arms. "I'll do it if you do it." The others exchanged uneasy glances. None of them had seen Mr. Winscot for weeks, and the stories swirling around the tall man made every creak of his old house seem sinister. But curiosity has a way of silencing fear, especially in a group of kids who thrived on testing the limits of their own bravery. As dusk gave way to night, the group huddled in the empty lot across from Mr. Winscot's house, their flashlights barely cutting through the thick shadows that seemed to cling to the property. The house itself looked like something pulled straight from a nightmare. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving jagged patches of gray and brown wood exposed. The windows, cracked and smudged, reflected nothing but darkness. And the porch sagged like a tired sigh, its boards warped and splintered from years of neglect. "Look!" Max's whisper cut through the silence, his finger trembling as he pointed to the upstairs window. At first, none of them saw it. Just the empty frame of the window, draped with a curtain that swayed faintly in the breeze. But then, as their eyes adjusted, they saw it, a shadow. It wasn't moving, but it wasn't still either. It was tall, unnaturally tall, stretching almost to the ceiling of the room. "Do you see that?" Sarah's voice was barely audible, her hand gripping Jake's arm tightly. It's probably a lamp or something," Jake offered weakly, though his face had gone pale. But they all knew better. Lamps didn't have shoulders, and they certainly didn't tilt slightly, as if watching. The figure became their obsession. They couldn't stop talking about it, dissecting every detail, every possibility. Was it the tall man? Was it something worse? Each night, they dared each other to get closer, to see more. The final plan came on a Friday evening, just as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. They would go in together. No more dares from the safety of the street, no more watching from the shadows. If the figure was real, they had to know. The closer they got, the more the air seemed to change. The crickets that sang endlessly on summer nights fell silent as they stepped onto the cracked sidewalk leading to the house. The boards of the porch groaned beneath their weight, the sound echoing like a warning in the oppressive stillness. Lizzie reached for the door, her hand shaking as she gripped the rusted knob. The others stood behind her, their breaths shallow, their flashlights trembling in their hands. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The air inside was thick and suffocating, carrying the scent of rot and neglect. Their flashlights flickered over the peeling wallpaper, the cobwebs that stretched like ghostly fingers across the corners of the room. Every step they took seemed to echo too loudly, as if the house itself was protesting their intrusion. And yet, despite the fear that gripped them, they couldn't stop. They had to know. What was that figure in the window? What had happened to Mr. Winscot? And most terrifying of all, was the legend of the tall man more than just a story? With each creak of the floorboards, they moved closer to answers they weren't sure they wanted. The old, rusted hinges groaned in protest as Lizzie pushed the door open, its slow creak echoing through the oppressive silence of the house. The group stood frozen in the doorway, their flashlights casting flickering beams of light into the darkness ahead. A wave of musty air spilled out to greet them, thick with the scent of decay, mildew, and something faintly metallic. "Are we really doing this?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their own shallow breaths. "No turning back now," Tommy muttered, stepping inside and pulling the others with him. The floorboards groaned beneath their weight, each step feeling louder than it should, as though the house itself was aware of their intrusion. Dust hung in the air, sparkling faintly in the dim light of their flashlights. They moved cautiously through the living room, where faded floral wallpaper curled at the edges, and an old moth-eaten armchair sat facing an empty fireplace. A broken picture frame lay shattered on the floor, its glass scattered like jagged pieces of ice. "Do you think he just left all this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Or something made him leave," Lizzie replied, her flashlight lingering on the fireplace mantel. A small collection of dusty knickknacks remained undisturbed, as though time had simply stopped here. The house was quiet, too quiet. No hum of appliances, no ticking of a clock, not even the faint creak of settling wood. Just silence, thick and oppressive, broken only by their own whispers and the occasional shuffle of their shoes against the dusty floor. "Upstairs," Tommy said, his voice firmer than the fear in his eyes betrayed. "That's where we saw it." They climbed the staircase slowly, their flashlights dancing across the peeling paint and exposed wood. Each step groaned louder than the last, threatening to give away their presence. As they reached the top, the air grew heavier, the smell of decay stronger. The hallway stretched out before them, a narrow, dim passage lined with closed doors. Their flashlights scanned the walls, revealing faded photographs of smiling faces that seemed to watch them with an unnerving intensity. "That's his room," Lizzie said, pointing to the door at the far end of the hall. The one with the curtain they had seen swaying in the window. The group moved as one, their footsteps tentative, their breaths shallow. The closer they got, the stronger the smell became, sour and sickly sweet. They paused outside the door, their flashlights trembling as they exchanged nervous glances. Tommy reached for the doorknob, his hand shaking. He turned it slowly, the mechanism clicking with a sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. The door creaked open, revealing the room beyond. At first, it looked empty. A bed, neatly made. A wardrobe, its door slightly ajar. A chair in the corner, draped with an old jacket. But then their flashlights landed on it, the figure hanging in the center of the room. It was Mr. Winscot, or what was left of him. His body hung limply from a rope tied to the ceiling, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his skin gray and bloated. The kids stared in horror, the reality of the figure they had seen in the window crashing down on them. "No," Sarah whimpered, stumbling back into Jake. It can't be." The room seemed to close in on them, the air thick with the stench of death. Lizzie turned to leave, her flashlight casting one last beam across the far corner of the room. And that's when they saw it. The shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, stretching from floor to ceiling, its edges shifting like smoke caught in a faint breeze. It didn't move like a person. It swayed unnaturally, as though observing them. And then, slowly, it began to stretch. The shadow's limbs extended, reaching out toward the children. Its form was no longer just a shadow. It was becoming solid, its surface rippling as though it were stepping out of the walls themselves. "Run!" Tommy shouted, his voice breaking the spell of terror that had frozen them in place. The group bolted, their footsteps pounding down the hallway and stairs, their flashlights bouncing wildly. Behind them, the sound of creaking would grow louder, faster, as though something was following. They burst through the front door, collapsing onto the overgrown lawn outside, gasping for breath. The house stood silent and still behind them, its dark windows like empty eyes watching their retreat. "Was that?" Jake started, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Tommy cut in, shaking his head. "I don't want to know." As they scrambled to their feet and fled down the street, none of them noticed the faint shadow in the upstairs window, swaying gently as if to wave goodbye. If this story made your skin crawl, hit that subscribe button. We promise, no tall man will follow you. But if you don't, well, let's just say, he's always watching. Don't risk it. Subscribe today. The kids didn't stop running until they were blocks away from Mr. Winscot's house, their lungs burning and their legs trembling beneath them. They collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air, their flashlights clattering to the ground. None of them spoke for a long moment, the silence between them filled with unspoken fear. The shadow, the figure, it was too much. They had gone looking for a legend and found something far worse. "Did you see it?" Jake finally whispered, his voice barely audible. They all nodded, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a terror they couldn't yet process. Whatever they had encountered in that house wasn't just a figment of their imagination. It wasn't just a story to scare each other with anymore. "We don't talk about this," Tommy said, his voice firm but shaking. "Ever." They agreed, though none of them could shake the feeling that the shadow had followed them, that it was still watching from the darkness as they hurried back to their homes. That night, none of them slept. And in the days that followed, they avoided each other, their bond fractured by the weight of what they'd seen. The news of Mr. Winscot's death broke the next morning. The town was shocked but not entirely surprised. He was a lonely man, people said. He must have given up. The official cause of death was ruled a suicide, but the whispers in Briarbell told a different story. The tall man had taken him, they said. He'd come for Mr. Winscot, feeding on his despair and leaving nothing but an empty shell behind. The legend grew stronger in the wake of his death. People spoke of seeing strange shadows near the house, of feeling an unshakable sadness whenever they passed by. The house was left abandoned, its windows dark and uninviting. It became a place of fear, a reminder of the emptiness the tall man seemed to crave. Years later, as an adult, I returned to Briarbell. The town looked smaller, quieter than I remembered, but the house at the end of the street was still there, unchanged by time. Its sagging porch and peeling paint seemed frozen in the moment we'd left it behind. I couldn't stop myself from looking at the upstairs window. For years, I had told myself that what we saw that night wasn't real, that it was just a trick of the light or the product of overactive imaginations. But as I stared at the window, I felt my heart skip a beat. There, standing tall and pale in the dim light of dusk, was a figure. His head tilted ever so slightly, his polite smile unwavering. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned away, unable to look any longer. I didn't need to see more to know. The tall man hadn't left. He was still there, waiting, watching, and perhaps searching for his next invitation. What do you think? Was the tall man just a figment of the town's collective imagination, born from loneliness and despair? Or was there something far more sinister lurking in the shadows of Briarbell? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your theories might just uncover a piece of the puzzle. Thanks for joining us on this chilling journey through the haunting legend of the Tall Man, here on Eerie Road Tales. If you enjoyed this story, or if it left you looking over your shoulder, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you're the first to know when we explore another spine-tingling mystery. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, some legends are better left undisturbed.